The Russian-Ukraine war is the current Cuban Missile Crisis of today. In this podcast, learn how overly pessimistic perceptions about the intentions of potential opponents tends to become self-fulfilling prophecies. In this podcast, we ask how the United States would react if the shoe were on the other foot. That is, if Russia acted towards the United States as the West has acted towards Russia. What were the implications for Russian security of the American withdrawal from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Missile Treaty? Didn't U.S. foreign policy experts publicly warn that NATO expansion would lead to disaster? Why are those responsible for NATO's failed expansion policy now doubling down on their mistakes? Did provocations place Russia in an untenable situation for which war seemed to Putin and his military staff the only workable solution? In the end, who bears primary responsibility for the ongoing disaster in Ukraine? Find out on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
This is Joe Biden's war president, hoping to get reelected through being a war president since they tend to get reelected.
All right, so how did Russia respond to, this last incident here?
Russia demanded a written guarantee that Ukraine would never become a part of NATO and that the alliance remove the military assets it deployed in Eastern Europe since 1997. The subsequent negotiations failed, as U.S. Secretary of State Mr. Blinken made clear. There is no change. There will be no change, end quote. You know, a month later, Mr. Vladimir Putin, launched the invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO.
Hell, man, I think at this point, this podcast makes it pretty clear that, during the past 30 years, senior U.S. foreign policy experts have repeatedly warned that in expanding NATO into Eastern Europe, the U.S. was making a dangerous policy error here. They were tempting, vicious. I would dare I say vicious beasts. Like we're not going to poke you with this stick, and they just start jabbing them just a little bit here, a little bit there, and they just keep doing it, and then breaking the same promises. I don't know why, but
I mean, your conclusion was said from the very beginning, Levi. In 1997, as NATO was taking a major step towards expansion, George Kennan, perhaps the most eminent American statesman then alive, during the 1940s, he pioneered the policy of containment and later served as ambassador to the Soviet Union. So he came up with the strategy that defeated the Soviet Empire. He warned that, and I quote, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, end quote. Kennan lamented the senselessness of the entire expansionary project, asking, and I quote, why, with all the hopeful possibilities engendered by the end of the Cold War, should East-West relations become centered on the question of who would be allied with whom, and by implication, against whom in some fanciful, totally unforeseeable, and most improbable future military conflict? And that quote was from A Fateful Error by George F. Kennan, February 5th, 1997, and the viewers, I hope, will look it up. Furthermore, a year later, in an interview with Thomas Friedman, the 94-year-old statesman Kennan responded to the Senate's ratification of NATO expansion, and I quote, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers turn over in their graves. And that quote is from Foreign Affairs, now a word from X. And the site is up there for our viewers to look at.
I'm just a little pissed, just a little pissed. So now I got to think that our leaders, and the military industrial complex, they see Russia as a mortal enemy, whether communist or not, and given what you just stated, it's a lot. It's really a lot to like take in.
Keenan, yet again, you're on page with Keenan. He alluded to that issue as well. He addressed it. He said, and I quote, "Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we're turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove the Soviet regime," end quote. Remember, Levi, the Russian people ended the Soviet Empire. Now, granted, it wouldn't happen without Reagan, the Pope, and Thatcher, but they did surrender without violence. They did essentially overthrow their own government. They did dismember the Soviet Republic. They did say, hey, we want to be like you. Help us the way you helped Japan. Help us the way you helped Germany after World War II. Help. And instead, we gutted them in the 90s for resources, led to the collapse of the Russian economy, where they defaulted on loans in 1998. And Vladimir Putin comes from that. And Keenan noted all this at the time. So everyone is culpable.
Yeah, it seems like that insight just wasn't really good enough for like our nation's leaders, which is a little, it's a little upsetting to hear.
It wasn't just Keenan, though, to be fair. Some did, many actually, there were, Levi, some prominent hawks who argued against expansion. Robert McNamara, ex-Secretary of Defense, who planned and implemented the massive bombing campaigns of the Vietnam War. He was against NATO expansion. Paul Nietzsche, Secretary of the Navy and Defense, who opposed Keenan's policy of static containment. He thought it was too wimpy. He was against NATO expansion. The crusading anti-communist Harvard academic Richard Pipes, who I like a lot, and who headed a team organized by the CIA to analyze the strategic capabilities and goals of the Soviet Union, against NATO expansion. Ex-CIA chief Robert Gates, who later became Secretary of Defense, against NATO expansion. Jack F. Matlock Jr., the second to last ambassador to the Soviet Union, who helped negotiate the end of the Cold War. These and there were other prominent Washington insiders publicly and strongly, vociferously opposed NATO expansion. And I put the site up for our viewers to see that substantiates all the assertions that I'm making here.
Clearly, their counsel wasn't followed, at all. But I guess, were there more warnings, or more, I guess, should I rather, are there more current warnings, like as we led up to like where we're going today? Were there other signs, anything like that?
There may be more, but there's one guy who sticks out like a sore thumb. And I've alluded to him a few times in this podcast, a professor and scholar I have immense respect for, John Mearsheimer, the University of Chicago professor. And I really hope our viewers will look him up on YouTube and see his podcast. But in 2015, Professor Mearsheimer began stating publicly that if the West didn't stop trying to integrate Ukraine militarily, politically, and economically, the Russians, out of concern for their security, might feel compelled to take military action, including attempting to, quote, wreck Ukraine as a way to remove it from the equation, a warning that, like George Keenan, proved prophetic and prescient.
Yeah, and it seems like, that just kind of faded into the background, instead of openly acknowledging the consequences of NATO expansion. We as a nation are attributing Putin's, recent invasion of Ukraine to the unhinged and unprovoked, sort of Nazi Hitler-like, whatever you want to call it, like drive to territorial expansion, and like even myself, I'll fully admit that, on the onset of seeing it, that's what it looked like a bit.
Yeah, and now though, I think Putin could live with a fractured, shattered Ukraine in different states. So, what Putin's aiming for now is very different. It's a new game now.
Yeah, like a wrecked or a like sort of like neutralized, like not neutralized. Like a very neutral Ukraine.
Yeah, a neutered, impotent Ukraine. It's bad. It's bad. In response to NATO expansion, Russia, I think at this point, is seeking to wreck the Ukraine. And you see that in my opinion, a manifestation of that is the attack on the energy grid and Russia's willingness to have military strategies recently in the last few months that would clearly involve more civilian casualties. I think initially Russia's strategy was specific to keep Ukrainian casualties, who they view as Russians, really, to a minimum, and I see that dissipating.
All right. I mean, I guess at this point, I would be doing my due diligence if I did ask for a little more elaboration on something specific. I think I already know the answer to this question, but like, why is Russia so sensitive to NATO expansion then? Like to kind
Well, I
of,
mean, we've talked about it in the recent past, but if you want to go deep, back into history, it's so organic. We have our Monroe Doctrine, we have our Manifest Destiny, but Russia, beyond Napoleon, we need to remain aware of the terrible consequences of the German invasion of Russia during World War II. And it gets personal here. Vladimir Putin's own family suffered during the siege of Leningrad. His older brother died in the long German siege of Leningrad, and several of his uncles perished. And I think it's fair to say that the suffering of Vladimir Putin's family is representative of the Russian nation. Although, the precise numbers aren't known, roughly, give or take, 25 million Russian citizens died during the German invasion of World War II. I mean, that's a death toll equal to about 1 in every 7 Russians then alive. Our median leaders are apparently also not noting the relevance of this painful history to the question of Russian security. And rather than pointing out how NATO expansion and the encroachment, or perhaps in Russian eyes, the re-encroachment of Western military power on Russia's borders resonates with that history, and rather than even posting a psychological sensitivity on the part of Vladimir Putin based on his own family's experiences, the only view we get is so imbalanced, is that Putin is motivated by a dangerous, irrational expansionism that's Hitlerian. And I hope this podcast has absolutely squashed that, and Putin is acting organically from Russian history, and the Russian people are with him. And 80,000 Russians have recently volunteered over the last 6 months to fight this war. The Russians are not running from the war in general. They're signing up overall to fight for it.
yeah, so there's, at least I hope there's no doubt at this point that Russia's perceptions of external threats have been deeply influenced by a very storied past,
Oh
a
yeah,
very,
man.
very
German
bloody
invasion.
past. Yeah.
Yeah, not just German World War II, but World War One, the Germans invaded. Russia 100 years earlier had been invaded by Napoleon, and they burned Moscow. Well, actually, the Russians themselves burned Moscow down, but
Yeah.
Napoleon reached Moscow. And unlike the US, Moscow doesn't have 2 major oceans to defend itself. I mean, everyone thinks our greatest military is the Air Force, Marines, Army and Navy, when really the greatest in US history, things we have is the Atlantic, the Pacific, and having neighbors like Canada and Mexico. My God, the Boy Scouts could defeat those countries militarily. I mean, how would you like to be Germany, surrounded by France, the Romans in Italy, Russia surrounded by China and Germany? We're surrounded by the Atlantic, the Pacific, Canada, and Mexico. Russia, and from being attacked from the Ukraine in that area, has no mountains to defend itself, no major rivers. It's set on a vast North Eurasian plain with no defensible borders from Western Europe, and a constant sense of threat from the West and East. Let's not forget about China. And in times past, the Mongols, they ran up and down Russia attacking it. So Russia is sensitive from being invaded. It's happened to them a lot, unlike the United States, which we were invaded in 1812 by the British and lost. But if they didn't have the greatest navy to get over the Atlantic, that wouldn't happen. We're in the catbird sea. We have it easy.
Yeah, and like, failing to take that into consideration, we instead choose to view, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're getting that Putin is an enraged Hitlerian land grabber. That's kind of like the narrative that's the narrative that's put out there. A modern version of this sort of pitiless hunt, for just conquest, for terror, and Putin himself is essentially Hitler incarnate, but paranoid, living in the imperial past, driven by innate Russian militarism, which, it's neither here nor there, I guess, from what I'm seeing. It's coming from an emotional core.
At the end of the day, though, the mainstream media, they're not discussing these truths. And, if you watch TV and the magazines and all, One might even imagine concerns about NATO expansion never even been raised. They were of a fringe nature, not really relevant and core to Russia. And although the role of the US and NATO in creating the crisis in Ukraine, I hope is obvious by now, many Americans and Europeans have been overcome by a kind of war fever by proxy, in my opinion, missing the big picture. And instead, they're preoccupied with this, what's going on in the daily battle, driven by a self-righteous anger and a conviction that the best policy is to pour more and more weapons into Ukraine until, Putin cries uncle or there's a regime change. And this is just dangerous, dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, in the light of an intensity of the war fever, it should not be surprising that those few U.S. political leaders who have the rare combination of clarity and guts required to openly discuss the background to the Ukraine war, they have been called traitors, and myself included, a little bit here and there. There's some political leaders I'm like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, and kind of just dismiss them offhand. And now there's a different perspective here.
I mean, I think, Ron Paul's pretty good. There are some patriots around that refusing to play the tribal game of my country can do no wrong. They recognize the uncomfortable historical truths, facts that we've alluded to. They're trying to avoid the same mistakes. I think there are some around here, I think of Tucker Carlson, they want to discern the implications of those facts for the present. They want to reduce the chances of an apocalyptic nuclear confrontation between Russia and the West. But these voices, John Mearsheimer, I've alluded to many times in this podcast, they are, Colonel McGregor, they are few and far between. There's not enough.
Yeah. Although I can't get on board with Tucker Carlson, that's a personal thing. I can't do that. But I can now see better. I can see the story of like an evil, irrational, intrinsically expansionist Russia, I would say, with a paranoid leader at its helm. That's not really what's here. They're not opposed by a virtuous United States and Europe. That's confused and strange and inconsistent with this whole series of directionally aligned events, during the past 30 years. That's just not the case. It's just a fairy tale. It's out there.
That fairy tale isn't just coming from our prior leaders, our current leaders who we've discussed, but I mean, mainstream media, yet again, has to bear a lot of responsibility here. Rather than seeking to contextualize the events we've alluded to for their readers or viewers, the media, mainstream media, has just trumpeted the Biden administration's preferred narrative. And, whatever its motivation, mainstream media have implemented and continue to implement, it's just propaganda that misinforms the public. And I'm assuming in Russia, they view it as an affront, making them, it's just not helping matters at all, and it's an avalanche. It's just wrong. In fact, as the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and First Amendment lawyer, Glenn Greenwald, has shown, massive censorship of dissenting views is now occurring at many levels of society in both the US and Europe. And I put the site up for our viewers to please read that, because we are undergoing a lot of censorship that's only allowing the mainstream narrative from the Biden administration, and prior to that, the President Obama's administration, and the neocons and Newland. And it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I mean, it's difficult because I'm an emotional man. I am. I'm very moved, very much swayed by, an altruistic tale or human suffering. It's very difficult to look at, horrific images on screen, coming out of Ukraine, and just feeling like revulsion, anger, people dying, succumbing to blind emotion, and then just embracing, the narrative that's pushed forward, this dominant Western narrative. But it's dangerous. It's a dangerous error. It really is. And I guess the best way that I can say it is it's kind of like looking at a really bright, beautiful, but thin screen. You see this very easy to understand image that's just thrown in your face over and over and over. And then that's all you see. But underneath is just this mountain of like sin, of distrust, of war, of betrayal. That and I know that sounds kind of like I'm waxing poetically a bit, but that's really how I see it. And like if you just break through that screen, you see all the true horror that's there.
All
You
right,
know,
let's go to the true heart of the matrix. The true heart of the matrix is the nexus of bureaucratic power and commercial interest that President Eisenhower, a five-star Army general, termed the military industrial complex. Many Trump Republicans call the deep state, but Eisenhower warned the American public in his final televised address as president about this source to which you alluded to poetically. And that's the ultimate source of what's going here, the money making. And Ron Paul, Senator of Kentucky, to his credit, recently tried to have an inspector general monitor the accounting and transparency of where the money went or is going to go in the recent omnibus bill that the Democrats unanimously voted for, the progressives unanimously voted for, and the Rhino Republicans, many of them voted for, with no accounting, no transparency to the American public on where the new round of many billions of dollars is going in this war. So how much war profiteering is going on right now, we'll just have to guess, even though Ron Paul gave us an opportunity to document and find out exactly how much.
yeah. I mean, in personal relationships, the combination of threatening actions and accusations of paranoia would be considered, gaslighting, today's day and age, and is the situation really so different in the realm of international politics? I mean, I think that's kind of the question that
I
comes to
guess
mind.
apparently not. Apparently not. During times of war, military threat, even the leaders of free countries lean towards authoritarianism. And Zelensky's abolished all dissenting parties. He's cracking down on the Russian Orthodox Church. The draft is now including teenage boys. And I understand some of that is when you're losing a war, you got to crack down and get tight. But the systemic attack on the Russian church, the Orthodox Church, is more than excessive. It's immoral and unethical. And, no dissent at all is dangerous. I mean, in the name of democracy, no dissent. So, but, when things are threatening, sensing great danger, politicians, we all have, right or left, tighten the reins of power, and they impose top-down control, and they get freedom of speech is now treasonous, and that's going on in the Ukraine. It's not extreme to suggest that the provocations described in this podcast, created in the mind of Putin and other members of the Russian, political and military class, there's an evolving sense, I would think, on their part, maybe of feeling sieged and a state of emergency being created. I mean, they are outnumbered. Their military budget is $65 billion a year, give or take, and we've doubled that in the amount we've given to Ukraine in less than a year. So I think that you'd start to feel a sense of emergency and siege. My point is you got to contemplate the possibility that Western actions contributed not only to Russia's foreign policies, but to untoward or darker aspects of Russia's domestic policies as well. And I come back, George Kennan to the rescue again. He predicted this in 1998. NATO expansion, he said, would, I quote, have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy. And so, whether inadvertently or not, we have set back more effective institutional Russian democracy by our actions over the last 20 years than anything. We ourselves have created more anti-democratic forces in the Ukraine and Russia than they themselves have, in my opinion.
Yeah, so it's pretty well stated. You've spoken very eloquently. Not only do you believe at this point that NATO expansion had the adverse effect of the development of Russian democracy, but it seems like you just fully blame, and I do too at this point. You blame the U.S. for this entire war in Ukraine.
I mean, had the United States not pushed NATO to the border of Russia, not deployed nuclear capable missile launch systems in Romania and planned them for Poland, which are probably operational by now, and perhaps elsewhere as well, not contributed to the overthrow of the democratically elected Ukrainian government in 2014, not abrogated the ABM treaty and then the intermediate range nuclear missile treaty, and then disregarded Russian attempts to negotiate a bilateral moratorium on developments, not conducted live fire exercise with rockets in Estonia to practice striking targets inside Russia, not coordinated a massive 32 nation military training exercise near Russian territory, not intertwined the U.S. military with that of Ukraine before they were a NATO member to make sure there was interoperability between men and resources and equipment, on and on and on it goes. Had the U.S. and its NATO allies not done these things, the war in Ukraine probably would not have taken place. And I think that is a reasonable assertion. And that's the assertion I'm making.
so much to say. I want to say it all at once. It's like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, no one act brought this war about, just so that's clear. It wasn't just one thing. It's very easy to do that, but the truth about it is it's a cumulative effect that had a like a network of effects that kind of like a spiral just sprang out of it, and it kind of ended us up where we are now.
Yeah, sprang out of it. I like that word because a non-linear effect. This wasn't an incremental, a cumulative effect. It was a non-linear effect, like an asymptote, and it did sprang. It shot out of a cannon, and had two or three of the provocations I referred to earlier. Had they not occurred, I think things could be very different today. It's a sandcastle built with cups of sand. You can't predict how much sand in which configuration the structure can bear. And it's clear the greater sand, more sand you put on it, the more unstable it becomes. But then all of a sudden, swoosh, it all falls. I think the war in the Ukraine is that kind of a collapse. I think there's no reason to think that more disasters won't follow. And I think we're headed that way, regardless of how much war planners in the US imagine they can gut Russia's military capacity. I think they are insane. I think, barring something very unusual, Russia's going to win the war or be in a winning position in this war by August or September of this year. And I wouldn't be surprised an offensive starts in Bakhmut around late January, early February, when the ground is hard enough in southern Ukraine to make a strong Russian push. That's my opinion.
All right, but just because I was just spinning in thoughts a bit, like, so there's a little bit, there's a well, some might say it's a major disconnect, but I mean, I agree that this may have affected the Ukrainian president. I always forget his name. I just know it's Zelensky. How you saying his first name? Vladimir Zelensky. He won the election in 2019. And won over 70% of the popular support. Running on a peace platform specifically, which doesn't quite mesh with everything that's going on.
Yeah, what's throwing you is Zelensky and Putin both have the same first name. It's Vladimir. Okay. So it's kind of weird that the two men who hate each other, they have the first name. They have the same first name, just so your confusion is justified. But more to the point, even with war looming, Zelensky, he wouldn't compromise for the sake of peace. On February 19, 5 days before Russia invades, Zelensky, met in Munich with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Scholz proposed to broker a peace deal. He told Mr. Zelensky that Ukraine should renounce its NATO aspirations and declare neutrality as part of a wider European security deal between the West and Russia. The pact would be signed by Putin and Biden, who would jointly guarantee Ukraine's security. Mr. Zelensky told Putin couldn't be trusted to uphold such an agreement and that most Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. His answer left German officials worried that the chances of peace were fading. And we have the site. It's up for viewers. To put it up while I was saying that. That is from Vladimir Putin's 20-year march to war in Ukraine and how the West mishandled it.
I mean, it's just pretty astounding. Just really taking it all in. Like, this cuts directly against what we've been repeatedly told, time and time again. They came to us and saying, look at this terrible thing, and it is terrible. I hope that's come across at this point, that this is a terrible situation. Ukraine is in a very, very precarious position, but it's not the whole truth. If any of it is true, there's not much truth that's actually there on the surface level.
No, and that's not the end of it. The US government, through its actions, I think, led Ukrainian leaders, including Zelensky, to adopt a more of a hard view towards Russia, made negotiations and negotiated peace in the Donbass between Kiev and pro-Russia a lot less likely. The US stoked the fires. It poured weapons into Ukraine, stepped up military integration, refused to renounce plans to incorporate Ukraine in NATO. So I think we consistently gave the impression, we'd go to war with Russia on Ukraine's behalf. We are quasi doing that now with the giving of Patriot missiles and HIMARS, which are going to have to be executed, despite what President Biden says, by either British Special Forces or U.S. contractors, which is a fancy word for U.S. mercenaries paid through front companies from the black fund of the CIA. So basically, we're entering the war. It's now becoming a hot war between the United States and Russia, which obviously could lead to a nuclear war quite quickly.
Yeah. So, like, at the end of the day, it seems Zelensky could have made peace with Russia by speaking just 5 words: Ukraine will not join NATO. You
Yes.
know, then if Putin was, I guess, bluffing about the decisive importance of NATO expansion, call his bluff.
Mhm.
Instead, we had this 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 catastrophe, man. We had this
Yeah.
this huge war that just kind of like came out of it
I mean, like you
unnecessarily.
said, if he would have said Ukraine will not join NATO, you call Putin's bluff. If he invades at that point, the whole world's against him, the whole world. And if he doesn't invade, problem solved. Problem solved. Instead,
Yeah.
you've got this frivolous, dangerous approach by the US to the fate of the Ukraine. And worst of all, the fate of the people, which you've alluded to, is a horrible humanitarian nightmare, which we largely created, we being the West, and I mean, Zelensky, an alleged advocate of peace who had a strong electoral mandate for negotiating an end to the Donbass conflict, instead dug his heels in and took a gamble on war. I'm suggesting that the US had given the impression to him and other Ukrainian leaders that it would go directly to war with Russia on Ukraine's behalf. So, I think Zelensky has been, somewhat duped.
I'm so focused on that phrase, gambled on war, but
Yeah.
yeah, but I guess without the provocations and the false impressions from the US, it seems likely Ukraine, would long ago have worked out this whole conflict with Russia, like adopting a stance of political neutrality, something like that by now, and only if it is lucky, Ukraine might yet achieve after, this whole destruction comes upon them, of half of its country, which is terrible, deaths of thousands, reputable damage done to infrastructure, so on and so forth, and displacement and immersion of millions, like hopefully they still find that light at the end of the tunnel, I hope.
This could have been worked out where Ukraine was made an international city like Kiev. There's a good, strong history of neutrality in Europe. Both Austria and Finland adopted neutrality towards the Soviet Union, and they benefited from it. And this could have been the case here. And, although the form of government, they're not communists anymore in Moscow, the geostrategic neutrality, reason for it is the same. And why it didn't happen in Ukraine. I think this could have been worked out with the Ukraine being like Austria was during the Cold War. The Ukraine could have been. There were viable solutions. We just didn't take it.
Yes, like to me, the key question is how much skin each side has in this fight. Ukraine, rather. It's not by any stretch of the imagination a vital security interest of the United States. That's just a fact. The reality is Ukraine hardly matters at all. From an American perspective, and I say this with no disrespect to the Ukrainian people. I'm wishing the best. I want them to make it out of this, but Ukraine is irrelevant. It's relevant as far as a U.S. perspective goes. Ukraine is no more important to the citizens of the United States than any one of 50 other countries that most Americans, for perfectly understandable reasons, let that be clear, it couldn't find on a map without a lot of random searching. So yes, Ukraine is irrelevant to America, the government, I should rather say. And I guess if the leaders of the United States and NATO had acknowledged this obvious fact, from the beginning, none of this would be happening. None of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and it's just, but I guess in contrast, for Russia with its 1,200-mile shared border and its history of 3 major land route invasions, from the West, the most recent of which, let's keep that in mind, the most recent of which was during World War II, caused the death of roughly 13% of the entire Russian population. I mean, my God, Ukraine is, I guess, the most vital interest right there.
I mean, can you imagine if we'd lost 13% of our population from Mexico, how guarded it would be? We'd have a hell of a wall there now, I'll tell you that. But I agree with your assessment. And, in my mind, what you're essentially saying, there is an existential threat that Russia perceives from a Western armed, trained, and military integrated Ukraine that should have been clear to, Washington, D.C. from the very start. Really, what sane person could believe that putting a Western arsenal on Russia's border would not produce a powerful response that we saw in February this year with an invasion? what sane person could believe that placing this arsenal would enhance American security? I mean, remember in World War I, the Germans sent a telegram, the Zimmerman telegram, the Mexican ambassador saying, if you go to war with the United States during World War I and we win, we'll give you all the territory you lost in the Mexican-American War of 1848. Mexico said, hey, we're not going to do that. U.S. found out about it. They invaded with General Pershing on Pancho Villa. We're about to invade the whole country just for thinking about it. And Mexico said, we didn't even think about it. So the hypocrisy of what we do, and look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're ready to go to nuclear war because the Russians are violating what we view as the Monroe Doctrine. They're in our area, our sphere of control. We're going to go to nuclear war in 1962 because of Cuba and the missiles being put there. And if you just flip the roles, flip it, I think it becomes farce what's going on here, you know? And so to me, this could have been worked out clearly, and the ambiguity of the situation, the uncertainty involved that we've been referring to, it could have been removed in 2008. 2008 was key when the U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who now heads President Biden's CIA, when he cabled to DC that Russia, Ukraine was the reddest of red lines, man, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand why. And that's when this whole thing should have been nipped in the bud. And to this day, since he's head of the CIA, I'd like to ask him, why haven't you nipped it in the bud now? But this transparent reality, for some reason, seems opaque to these neocons, military industrial complex, deep state, money-loving military contracts to many people in the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Defense, NATO, media, and, you know, our current president, the point man of the Ukraine since the Obama administration, President Joe Biden.
Yeah, so, all right, so just trying to lead it all out of me. All right, so core heads prevail here, so let's stay on track. So, like, where does this leave the citizens of the United States and its European allies? Where does that leave us?
In a real bad spot, you know, putting the entire world at risk of nuclear war. And yet it's it could, you know, this could only have been arrived at through a level of American government stupidity and blindness, and also amongst the leaders of Europe, a level of deference and cowardice. I mean, Europe's basically a vassal of the United States, which we didn't mind when we're fighting the communists, the Soviet Empire, but not now. The Soviet Empire doesn't exist. It's inconceivable that Europe's rolled over and our government's been this daft. You know, what American citizens most need to know about the war is that your lives are in danger. Know that Putin has been on record that he does not contemplate a world without Russia. Therefore, an existential threat to Russia can be met with nuclear war. And if the American intent is to destroy Russia, then the American intent will be self-destruction in a nuclear war. The United States, under the Biden administration, is facing an existential threat of its own making greater than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the escape from this threat is in front of everybody's nose. Cut an artful deal with Vladimir Putin and the Russians. We need someone who's good at making deals. Cut a deal, negotiate. And the American government, Joe Biden, have refused to negotiate and instead demanded regime change, which is not going to happen short of destroying Russia. That's where we're at.
Well, I mean, at the very end of this, I know it was a heavy topic. You know, I got a little riled up. I know you certainly got a little riled up, but we can always just, you know, hope and pray for the best and hope that this pans out. At least it's already a little bit on the downslope, at least in the best way imaginable, where the least amount of lives, least amount of casualties are taken. That's at least what I'm hoping for.
Right now, I think we're on the highway to hell, and you heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist. Thank you for listening. I tried to outline in this podcast how circumstances surrounding the current conflict in Ukraine are actually much deeper than what is apparent in many mainstream Western sources. The more accurate narrative is how the West is leading Ukraine down a path where it will get wrecked by Russia. For almost 200 years, starting with the framing of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the United States has asserted security claims over virtually the entire Western Hemisphere. It could do this because of its naval power and has asserted this doctrine many times. Any foreign power that places military forces near the United States territory knows damn well it's crossing a red line and does so at its own peril. U.S. policy thus embodies a conviction that where a political opponent places its forces, it's crucially important. In fact, this conviction is the cornerstone of American foreign and military policy, and its violation is considered reason for war. Yet when it comes to Russia, the United States and its NATO allies have acted for decades in disregard of the very same principle. They have progressively advanced the placement of their military forces toward Russia, even up to its borders, as now is the case in Ukraine. They have done this with inadequate attention to, and sometimes blith disregard for how Russian leaders might perceive this advance. Had Russia taken equivalent actions with respect to US territory, say, God forbid, placing its military forces in Canada or Mexico, Washington would have gone to war and justified that war as a defensive response to the military encroachment of foreign power. Let's not forget the Zimmerman telegram in World War I, where Germany sent a telegram to Mexico's ambassador, and Mexico didn't even contemplate declaring war on the United States during World War I to get back its territory that it lost in the American-Mexican War, and yet still General Pershing essentially invaded and attacked Mexico for even considering it, which they may not have even have done. So this has gone on before, and I quote the Zimmerman telegram. You can look it up on the internet, 1916 World War I. So when viewed through this lens of history, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is seen not, or should not be seen, as the unbridled expansionism of a malevolent Russian leader, but as a violent and destructive reaction to misguided Western policies. An attempt to reestablish a zone around Russia's western border that is free of offensive threats from the United States and its allies seems to be what the Russians are after. And the US would do the same if the shoe was on the other foot. Having misunderstood why Russia invaded Ukraine, the West is now basing existential decisions on false premises. In doing so, it is deepening the crisis and maybe sleepwalking us toward nuclear war. People look for a date or action that triggered this war. Well, there is one. On November 10th, when the United States and Ukraine signed a Charter on Strategic Partnership, which asserted America's support for Kiev's right to pursue membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the pact made it likely than ever that Ukraine would eventually join NATO, an intolerable prospect for Vladimir Putin. It was the last straw. Preparations immediately began for Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. So an alliance established to prevent war ignited one, ironically. But even before invading, Moscow found prior evolving situations near its border intolerable and began mobilizing its army on Ukraine's border before they invaded to signal its resolve to Washington, D.C. But it had no effect as the Biden administration continued to move closer to Ukraine. This led Russia to precipitate a full-blown diplomatic standoff in December 2021. As Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, put it, and I quote, "We reached our boiling point," end quote. That quote was from The Economist issue of March 11, 2022. I highly recommend you read it. Also in December 2021, writing in the journal Foreign Policy, the Russian ambassador to the United States noted that NATO was carrying out roughly 40 large military training exercises per year near Russia. He warned, and I quote, "The situation is extremely dangerous," end quote. The Russian ambassador once again stated what had been made clear 13 years earlier in William Burns' famous "Niet means niet" cable, and I quote, "Everything has its limits. If our partners," meaning the US and NATO countries, "keep constructing military strategic realities imperiling the existence of our country, we will be forced to create similar vulnerabilities for them. We have come to the point where we have no room to retreat. Military exploration of Ukraine by NATO member states is an existential threat for Russia," end quote. And here I've been citing from the article in Journal Foreign Policy, peer-reviewed, very respected, and the title of the article is "An Existential Threat to Europe's Security Architecture," the author Anatoly Anatov, the date December 30th, 2021. And so we can see incrementally, in steps small and large, the West has disregarded Russia's reasonable security concerns, considering them largely irrelevant. thereby stoking Russian concerns about encirclement and invasion. At the same time, the United States and its European allies have implied that a rational actor would be assuaged by the West's statements of benign intention, that the weapons, training, and interoperability exercises between Ukraine and NATO, no matter how provocative, powerful, or close to Russia's borders, are purely defensive and not to be feared by Russia. In many instances, Western leaders, especially from the United States, have actively disrespected Mr. Putin, sometimes insulting him to his face. He's crazy, he's Hitler, he's Satan, he's insane, et cetera, et cetera. These provocations that the United States and its allies have directed at Russia are policy blunders so serious that, had the situation been reversed, US leaders would long ago have risked nuclear war with Russia. You heard it here on Emir Phillips, American Pragmatist.